I want to welcome you all to this event in which we look at media economics and entrepreneurship. This is part of a series that we've launched here at the Annenberg School that tries to pay more attention to the important issues of the market and the ways in which the market forces impact on communications, journalism, and the media in general. This is a series that will be going on throughout the rest of this semester and also next year. We're also delighted to announce that we will have an entrepreneur in residence who will be selected by Chris's committee and will be joining us through the generosity of one of our supporters. I do want to thank Chris, first of all, for the good work that he and his committee have done over the past semester in organizing these events and getting out the word, and especially for selecting top-notch people who will be coming in. Gabe Kahn, I think, will be hosting a guest next Tuesday, and I urge all of you to attend that event as well. Our speaker today is, Chris will introduce him, but I simply wanted to take this opportunity to welcome here. I've been tracking his work for a number of years when he started doing some fascinating analysis of the different structures of networks. And Eric and I have talked a little bit already about future work that we might be able to do together with him at MIT and us here on the left-hand coast. So I want to welcome each and every one of you, and I now turn the floor over to Chris.
Well, welcome, everyone. I want to echo what the Dean has said and just say that we're all delighted that you're able to join us this morning. I'm really gratified to see so many colleagues from Annenberg's faculty and colleagues from Marshall and elsewhere around the university. It's great to see so many graduate students and undergraduates alike and guests from beyond the university's walls. I also want to just take a few minutes to acknowledge my partner in this enterprise, Gabe Kahn, who's new to our faculty in the journalism school, and he's been a terrific colleague to work with and a real asset to our overall strategy here at the school. He can't be with us at the moment. He's finishing up with class, but if he's able to join us, it'll be great to have him here. I'd also like to pay a few words of gratitude to the M2E committee members, many of whom are here, and all of whom have been doing great work getting this enterprise going. We have a whole range of events planned for later on this spring, predominant among which after this one is next Tuesday, Gabe Kahn is going to be welcoming Ken Doctor, the founder of Newsonomics, to this exact location. So at noon next Tuesday, the 25th, I highly encourage you to come to that interaction as well. I'd also like to thank Lana Swartz, Giovanna Carrera, and the other members of the Annenberg Event Committee for finding us this space in this overused building of ours and pulling this organization together. So as the Dean had mentioned, the Media Economics and Entrepreneurship Program, M2E, is really designed to consolidate all of the many approaches taken here at the school to the structural forces influencing media and communication industries today. And it's a really peculiar moment to be looking at that in the wake of and in the midst of the economic crisis that's really been that's swept upon us several years ago. And it's really the economic crisis that has heightened all of our awareness that standard operating procedures, both in our individual lives and in our institutional lives, is really not going to be able to pass muster any longer. And so everyone, all economic actors, from individuals to governmental agents to institutions and private businesses, are having to rethink their approaches to business. And central to that is information technology. IT is really at the hub of all creative destruction and innovation that goes on in all economies, and it's really central to all of our deliberations as to what productivity will be going forward. And at the on the issue of productivity and its relationship to IT, we couldn't ask for a better person to join us to really frame that conversation than Erik Brynjolfsson, who's the director of MIT's Center for Digital Business and also the Schuschel Family Professor at the MIT Sloan School of Management. He's been looking at, his research has been looking at the way that companies use IT to drive innovation and position themselves for better competitive advantage, both now and after we pass through this great economic inflection point. And he's going to share with us a few of his research results on exactly how IT is really shaping what competitive advantage looks like. He's also the research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. He's on the Academic Advisory Board of the Federal Reserve Bank in Boston, and he's also on Time Magazine's Board of Economists. So without further ado, I'd just like to join me in welcoming Erik Brynjolfsson.
Thanks, Chris. That was a very kind of introduction. I very much appreciate also your invitation and the dean and the school for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure to have a chance to share some of my research. As Chris mentioned, we've been doing a lot of work on how IT is driving productivity and innovation at the MIT Center for Digital Business. And one of the things I'm looking forward to is having a chance to interact with all of you and hear some of your thoughts when I present this. So please don't hesitate to, if you have questions or comments, raise your hand and we can discuss that. I'll try and leave some time at the end as well for some discussion. So I look forward to interacting with all of you on that. Now, as Chris mentioned, this has been a tough time. We've been going through tremendous changes in the economy. Economists like me to keep track of a lot of statistics, and some of the more dismal ones are the ones we see what's happening to unemployment and the deficit and related areas. And if you compare the current recession to the previous 10 ones, you see that it's a lot worse in a lot of different dimensions. We're much deeper, and it's probably going to be a much longer recession than the earlier ones. But I think it's also an opportunity because although people talk about the Great Recession, I strongly believe that within the next 5 years or so, people will be talking about this time also as the Great Restructuring, real turnaround in the way businesses, especially American businesses, are organizing their work and how they're using digital technologies in particular to transform innovation. And what I'm going to talk with all of you today is about that process, the types of restructuring and reorganization that companies are doing driven by digital technologies. And in particular, I'm going to share with you 4 primary ways that IT is driving innovation and go into some depth and some examples of each of them. And again, I welcome your feedback and comments on all of them. Now, for some time, I've been looking at some basic interactions between information technology and productivity, the performance of firms. And there are a lot of ways of analyzing it. Probably the simplest way, though, is just to show you a scatter plot that shows you the relationship between IT and productivity, where each of these little dots here, I could call them crosshatches, represent individual firms in the U.S. economy, thousands of firms that we've studied. Now, one thing you see in this is that there's sort of somewhat of an upward sloping relationship there, that on average, more IT-intensive firms tend to be somewhat more productive. But I don't think that's the most important message. I want to emphasize something else, which is the tremendous amount of scatter that you see in this chart. There are some firms that are very productive, very above average in productivity, and above average in IT, but there's also firms that spend a lot on IT that are less productive than the industry average. In fact, as you can see, there are firms in all 4 industry quadrants. So IT by itself is neither necessary nor sufficient to driving performance. It's correlated with it, but there's clearly a lot of other things that are going on. And a lot of that has to do with how well companies learn how to use information technology. Now, one hypothesis that people have been looking at is that over time, more companies would learn the best techniques, and we'd see a convergence, a digital convergence, a convergence in performance as companies picked up on the best practices. And over time, this dispersion should become less and less as the new technologies diffuse and everybody picks up on them. And in fact, people like Nick Carr at Harvard Business Review wrote an article that said IT doesn't matter, that it's like a utility, like electricity, or he compared it to the railroads, that everyone has access to it, so there's no real competitive differentiation. Well, this is a testable hypothesis, and so one of the things we've been looking at more closely is not so much the mean, whether or not IT is correlated with more productivity, but the dispersion, the variance, and that's a good metric of the amount of innovative activity and turbulence in the economy. So one way to look at that is you look at something like the gross profit margin between different firms. And this chart doesn't show the average profit margin. What this shows is the dispersion in profit margin. That is the gap between the top quarter and the bottom quarter of firms in each industry. So what we did, just to explain this chart, is we took all the industries in the economy. Actually, we divided it into 61 industries for this particular chart. And in each firm, we ranked all the firms from the ones that are most profitable to least profitable in the auto industry, the media industry, the pharmaceuticals industry, banking, and so forth, each of the different industries. And the top quarter were on average, as you can see, about 15 to 20% more profitable than the bottom quarter. And that gap between the most profitable and the least profitable was fairly steady throughout the entire time period. Actually, I don't know why the years aren't showing on this particular chart. Maybe it'll come up on later ones. But going back to the 1960s, back through the past decade, you see that on average, the leaders have maintained a fairly consistent gap. Well, that's true for many of the industries in the economy, but actually, if you subdivide the economy into two groups, the low IT industries and the high IT industries, you see somewhat of a different chart. So this chart, we have the high IT industries and the low IT industries, and the high IT industries are the ones that are using information technology a lot. Not necessarily producing IT, but the ones that are consuming it, buying a lot of IT, have more IT workers, more IT capital. We slice and dice it different ways. They all look almost exactly the same. IT-intensive industries. Some of them are manufacturing, some of them are in services, some of them are in media. They're across the economy, but they have in common high IT. And what you see is that although high and low IT industries were fairly similar in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and early 90s, starting about a decade ago, about 10 to 15 years ago, some firms started pulling away from the others. And the gap between the leaders and the laggards has gotten bigger and bigger in these high IT industries. So there's something going on in the economy where rather than converging, as we hypothesized a couple slides ago, we're seeing a greater dispersion where the leaders are pulling away from the laggards. And that is especially true in high IT industries. So whatever is driving this is correlated with information technology or the use of information technology. Now, we looked at some other metrics comparing high and low IT industries, and they differ in other ways too. For instance, if you look at the concentration of these industries, here we now have the years. So back in the 60s through about the early 1990s, the whole US economy was actually becoming somewhat less concentrated. This is the C20 index, which is the market share of the top 20 firms in each industry. Again, you can measure it different ways, but the story stays the same, that historically, the US economy was actually becoming somewhat less concentrated up until the past 10 or 15 years or so, where it started becoming more concentrated. The winners are dominating their industries more and more. Firms like Google and Microsoft have dominated the tech industries, but what this shows is this is happening all throughout the economy, not just in internet and media companies, but in all the other types of companies and industries in the economy. And the turnaround has been especially steep in the high IT industries. And the third thing I want to show you in terms of changes in the economy that are happening recently is what's happening to turbulence. Turbulence is another metric that I found very interesting. And what that is how frequently companies change position, whether the leaders stay on top or whether they get toppled and taken over by other companies. So what this is the average sales turbulence, how frequently companies change position in the rankings. We ranked all the firms in each industry from 1 to whatever number of firms there were in the industry. And every time a firm changed ranking, say it went from 2 to 3 or from 2 to 1, that would be a change of 1 in the rankings. We added up all of those and compared them for each industry. And once again, you see that there was relatively little turbulence in the 60s and 70s, and things got a little more turbulent in the 80s, and then it really took off in the late 90s, and the economy has become much more turbulent. So I think a lot of managers say, gee, it seems like it's tougher, competition is harder now, the winners are pulling away, but they're not as stable as they used to be. You can't stay on top as easily. Companies like GM maybe stayed on top for decades. Now, the ability to stay on top of an industry is more like years or even months. And that shows up in this chart. Once again, the other thing that's very striking is that this turbulence is especially high in the IT using industries, not just not the whole economy, and again, it's not the IT producing industries. So put these three things together, the leaders pulling away from the laggards, more concentration, more turbulence, and it's a description of an economy that's becoming increasingly Schumpeterian. There was an economist called Schumpeter who coined the phrase creative destruction that Chris mentioned in the introduction. He's exactly right, that what we're seeing is an economy that is based more and more on creative destruction than ever before. I think people have said that anecdotally. You've seen case studies of it. I think this is some of the first quantitative evidence that shows this isn't just people's intuition or gut feel. It's not based on a few isolated examples. It's based on a broad analysis of the whole U.S. economy that we are becoming more Schumpeterian. I think it's fair to say that some industries have always been more Schumpeterian than others. In particular, the industries that you all study, media, communications, have tended to be somewhat more Schumpeterian because of the inherent economies of scale. Software, high technology, computer industries have also been fairly Schumpeterian. But what this says is this is happening more and more throughout the economy. And it's happening first in industries that use IT. And those can be in manufacturing, services, and many other industries as well. So those are some of the changes that we're seeing in the economy. And as I mentioned, it's getting tougher and tougher to compete. Now, one of the things that companies are doing is they're trying to adopt and use information technology and digital technologies more effectively. But the problem is harder than simply adopting IT. If you simply try to substitute and take your analog business processes, your analog products, and convert them to digital products, that isn't going to maintain your profitability or market share. The problem is that in industry after industry, what we're seeing is that large profits in analog terms become much smaller or disappearing profits when you go to the digital world. I can show you a couple of examples of this. I think many of you in this room probably know this very well, maybe better than I do already. But take the newspaper industry, under tremendous pressure right now. One example is what's happening at classified ad sales. This red chart here, you can see starting in about 2005, classified ad sales started really plummeting and have continued to fall. Now, digital ads have been growing. You see Craigslist revenue is growing seemingly at almost the same rate, and so those two lines are crossing. You might think from the perspective of the U.S. economy as a whole, it's a zero-sum game, less revenue for analog newspapers and more revenue for digital sites. However, you need to look at this chart a little more closely and realize that it's a little more dismal than that. You see, the classified ad sales are measured in billions of dollars over here on the right scale. The digital Craigslist revenue is measured in millions of dollars. So we've got a huge discrepancy here that a lot of the revenue is just disappearing from that ecosystem. That's not necessarily bad for consumers. They've been paying a lot less than they used to pay. But from perspective of GDP measurement, there's a lot of output that's just plain disappearing. It doesn't show up in the GDP statistics anymore. In fact, one of the surprising things that I discovered when I first started looking at this is that if you look at the information share of the economy, information, media, and related areas, it seems obvious to me, and probably all of you, that the economy is becoming much more information intensive. The amount of digital information is doubling about every 1.2 years. Yet according to the official US GDP statistics, the information sector is smaller today than it was 30 years ago. How can that be? It's because the GDP is actually shrinking even as the underlying quantity of bits is growing tremendously. You see this in other areas as well. I'll quickly touch on the music industry. This is an article I wrote last year about the music industry. And you can see that physical shipments are going down, digital downloads are going up. The total amount is actually growing. Total amount of music is growing. So it's not that we have less music than we used to have, but the revenues are plummeting. So we're getting more music. There's less GDP, less measured output than there was before. And it's not just media industries either. It's happening in physical products. Part of that is because physical products are becoming more information intensive. Even automobiles now have more value in their information, the semiconductors and so forth in them, than they do in the steel in them. And industry after industry, product after product is becoming more information intensive. It's also because of what information is doing to competition. The reason we started the Center for Digital Business was that a banker came to us and was very worried that the customers were able to find lower interest rates when they were borrowing and higher interest rates than when they were lending to the bank, and that gap where the bank was making the money was shrinking because of much lower search costs. Previously, he didn't quite say it this way, but previously a lot of that bank's competitive advantage was based on geography and ignorance, namely the fact that consumers would only go in their local neighborhood as opposed to going to the internet and finding competitors nationwide or worldwide, and that they were relatively ignorant of what the alternatives were. Now both those barriers have faded away. Consumers are well informed, and they can shop nationally or globally, and that means that banks need to find other sources of competitive advantage, and the traditional barriers are slipping away. And that's true in every industry, not just in banking. So that's a little bit depressing, at least for business managers who are looking for ways to maintain profitability. But what I'm going to focus on the rest of this talk is a more optimistic side, which is that information technology not only destroys profits, but it also creates the potential for new innovative opportunities. And the companies that are embracing that are succeeding and becoming those winners that we saw on the chart before. They're coming to dominate their industries. It may not be as stable as it used to be, but it can be very, very profitable for some firms that have embraced this innovation imperative. We've just finished a couple of studies with a graduate student, Hee-Kyung Kim, and I want to talk a little bit about, I'll just mention a couple of the headlines in that, and then we'll talk about what these firms are doing. What we did was we looked at a bunch of firms and we asked them about how they went about making decisions, whether they mostly made decisions based on intuition and experience, gut feel, or whether they mostly used data and whether they had an analysis of their customers, their products, and their processes. And based on this set of questions, we ranked the firms on this scale. And the firms that were most data-driven, or at least that said that they were most data-driven, were on average about 4% more productive and 6% more profitable than their competitors after controlling for all the other inputs, their labor, capital, materials, industry, year, all the observable characteristics we controlled for, and we found that this data-driven decision-making was a huge differentiator, a statistically significant differentiator between more successful and less successful firms. We also found that they were pulling away from their competitors in terms of market value, which is greater. And interestingly, we also looked at the compensation of the executives, and we found that they, on average, paid their executives significantly more. And we're looking into that a little bit more depth as well. So data-driven decision makers are winning this battle. What are they doing? What are they doing that's different? Well, I'm going to argue that there are four main drivers of innovation that IT has made possible. And understanding each of these will be a key to getting into that top group as opposed to the companies that are having a harder time keeping up. So those four drivers are, number one, measurement, being able to measure things in a much more fine-grained way. I'm not talking about a 10 or 20% improvement. I'm talking about orders of magnitude improvement in the ability to understand your customers, your business processes, your products, and I'll give you some examples of that. The second thing is experimentation, the ability to do controlled field experiments. Now, this is something that scientists have been doing for a couple of centuries now, and one of the reasons why we've had such good scientific progress starting about the 1700s, business management have been lagging behind. They haven't been doing those kinds of experiments, but leading firms are doing them, led by some of the internet companies. But as I'll show you, it's happening in a lot of other industries as well. And this is really the best way to get at causality, understanding causal relationships. The third thing is sharing, and this is sort of obvious. It's really the main thing that people have been using the internet for, the wikis and all the other Enterprise 2.0, Web 2.0 technologies that are making it easier to take innovations and disseminate them more quickly throughout the organization. And finally, replication. The leading companies are taking their innovations and embedding them in a digital infrastructure in a way that makes it possible for them to replicate them to dozens, hundreds, even thousands of other locations. When they do that, they multiply the benefits proportionately. So previously, if you had a smart manager who improved the order entering process at a coffee shop, that coffee shop would be somewhat more profitable. Now, if that process is embedded in digital technology, that improvement can be replicated, and the whole firm can beat its competitor proportionately. So let me talk about each of those in a little bit more depth, starting with measurement. So I would contend that all great scientific revolutions, if you trace them back, start with a revolution in measurement. And one example of that is this guy here. Anybody recognize who he is? Close. It was a contemporary. It's actually Antony van Leeuwenhoek. I guess they all used to wear these hoods there. Now, maybe he's not as famous as he should be, but he was the developer of a first set of microscopes. And in fact, there's one of them in this picture here. See that little thing right there he's holding? I know, it looks like the new iPhone, but it's actually not. Which may also be an important revolution. That is one of his microscopes. With this microscope, he was able to look inside a drop of water and for the first time see the little creatures swimming around. He looked in his own drops of blood and saw corpuscles. He called the animals inside of, or the creatures inside of the drop of water, he called them animalcules. And he wrote to the Royal Society of London telling them about his discovery, and nobody believed him. They said, look, you know, you're obviously nuts. It's not possible for an animal to be shrunk down so small that it fits inside of a drop of water. And they didn't believe him, and he kept writing these letters. And finally, he persuaded some people to come out and take a look, because no one else had these microscopes. And he showed them, and lo and behold, as you all know, there are microbes inside drops of water and in your blood and everywhere else. And, of course, biology and medicine have never been the same. Probably many of us are alive today because of the fact that biologists and doctors were able to use this revolution in measurement, this ability to see things in more detail, and that has changed those sciences and those professions. I would argue that we are now in the midst of an equally large, maybe even more important, I say without hyperbole, revolution in business management, our ability to measure things. You could call that nano data, the ability to get very fine-grained data. And I've listed a bunch of them here. I'm not going to go through each of them, but we've done studies with virtually every one of these types of fine-grained data. Obviously, one example is clickstream data, that when a customer goes to a website, the businesses can now observe that customer as they browse around. They can essentially see every time someone picks up an object and looks at it, checks the price, puts it back on the shelf, goes over and looks at other things, reads the reviews. In a supermarket or a conventional store, you would never really be able to keep track of all that. And even if you could somehow get it on camera, it would be almost impossible to make any sense of it. But with websites, it's very, very easy. And as you know, just about every retail company carefully analyzes their weblogs and knows exactly what happens every time they change a price or they change the background color or they put a new product up. Who looks at it, who considers the product, who buys it, which reviews matter. All that information is carefully tracked and analyzed. So that's one kind of information. Mobile phone data, keeping track of where people are, email messages, RFID, radio frequency ID. Each of these is examples of data that is orders of magnitude, not even 10 or 100 times, but often thousands or millions of times more detailed than anything we've had before. By comparison, for the previous decades, centuries really, businesses have been almost flying blind in terms of knowing what their customers were doing, what their employees were doing. It was all kind of a big black box. Now we have a great deal of very fine-grained data, and companies are analyzing these in great detail. And it's becoming more and more pervasive. By 2015, there'll be over 1 trillion sensors on the planet Earth. It'll be like a skin that the planet is developing that will sense what's going on, and they'll be hooked into a nervous system, the internet, that'll allow us to keep track of all sorts of information and use it if we want to. And this is growing very, very rapidly. As I mentioned, it's doubling about every 1.2 years. Just in the past 2 days, more digital information was collected than in all of previous history up to the year 2003. So you can see that pace is really astronomical. Now, this is changing how decision-making is done at leading companies. More and more, they're focusing on data as opposed to hippos. Anybody know what hippo refers to? Anybody? What's that? Hippopotamus? Well, that's what it used to refer to. But Ron Kahavi up at Microsoft has coined the term hippo. It stands for the traditional way that most companies have been making decisions, which is that when there's an important decision to be made, they gather the top people together in a room and they discuss it, and then when they're done, they go with a hippo, which is the highest paid person's opinion. So that's been working okay for a few centuries, but now more and more companies are switching to relying on data-driven decision-making. At UPS, they're using it to route trucks. They analyzed the data, and it turned out that they weren't optimizing their truck routing, and they come up with a bunch of new algorithms of ways of getting the trucks there more quickly. One of the more amusing ones I discovered was that in most American cities, UPS trucks, if you look at them, they no longer make left turns. The truck routes only involve right turns. Anybody guess why that would be the case?
It's more efficient.
Yeah, it's more efficient. When you get a left turn, you have to stop through the light, and it turns out that it's always better to turn right and right and right that way. Wine chemistry, you might think this is something that's pure judgment, taste, something a computer could never do. But let's face it, the reality is that wine is a set of chemicals, and you can analyze those chemicals. And if you analyze them carefully enough, you can get a sense of what the flavor of the wine is going to be. A company called Enologics has done that, and they've been able to predict the rating that a wine will get on Robert Parker's scale, 100-point scale, before he even tastes it. Housing sales. We just did a study. I did a study with another graduate student, Lynn Wu, who's on the market if any of you guys are hiring. She's very good.
Show us the data.
And here's the data. Okay, you asked for it. We looked at the searches people are doing on Google. There are almost 100 billion searches that are done every month on Google. And you think about it, each one of those searches is a window into people's intentions, their hopes, desires, the things they want, the things they are about to buy. Google records all of that, as you know, so be careful what you search for. And they make that information available in an anonymized form, so now we have a view into what people are thinking of buying or thinking about based on their Google searches. These hundreds of billions of searches. It's just a phenomenal amount of data. We decided to match that up with housing sales and housing prices. As you know, there's been a crash in housing, and it's coming back. Google makes available all the searches on housing-related terms. You can categorize people looking for real estate agents, for mortgage brokers, all sorts of housing-related information. And they even do it by state. Actually, they do it by metropolitan area. It's a little too much data to show you right now. And so we went ahead and we calibrated when people were searching to what housing sales were that month, 3 months later, 6 months later, also what housing prices were in the future. As you can imagine, before people buy, they search. So it's really looking forward at what's going to happen in the future. That's a big contrast to the official government data or the National Association of Realtors, which only provides a rearview mirror that's much coarser about what the sales were last quarter. Well, the NAR does a projection of the future based on their rearview data, and we decided, hey, let's see how well we can do with this Google data that we've calibrated on the past few years. Last year, the National Association of Realtors predicted that sales would increase by 8.1%. Our data, based on Google information, was that they would increase by 6.4%. We went ahead and presented this, or submitted this, to the National Bureau of Economic Research and had some housing real estate economists be as discussants, so I was a little nervous. I was especially nervous because I knew that between the time of submission and the time of my presentation, the real data would come out as to what the sales actually were. So this is not something I necessarily recommend as a research strategy, as a presentation strategy. But fortunately, one of the reasons that I'm showing you this slide is that it worked out okay. The actual sales increased by 6.1%, which, as you can see, was much closer to our prediction using Google data rather than all the expert economists. This was most definitely not because I'm an expert on real estate pricing or Lynn is an expert. We know very little about the real estate market. But this data just made it very easy. With a relatively simple model, you can see the paper, a relatively straightforward model, much more fine-grained data gave a much better prediction. In fact, we were able to predict all of the different cities and states with much more accuracy as well. So this was a very simple, straightforward approach. You can use it for lots of other things. Now, there are lots of other examples I could give you of this nano data and how it's revolutionizing not just research, but perhaps more importantly, business decision making. But I want to push ahead to the other points because I'm realizing I'm running a little low on time here. Nano data is great for identifying correlations, but if you really want to understand what's driving, what the causality is, there's only one way to really do that well, and that is the gold standard in science, which is experimentation, having a true controlled experiment. It's something that economists almost never do, social scientists almost never do, but I think that's going to change, and the way is being led by business managers who are doing more and more business experiments. For instance, at Amazon, they do a couple of hundred experiments every day, okay? They're doing real business experiments, and a lot of internet firms are leading that. At Amazon, for instance, they experiment with putting the shopping cart on the right versus left. They have Kindle information. They change how big the stars are, all sorts of things like that. People are constantly iterating. Instead of having some hippos, some experts tell them, okay, this is how you should design the web page, they just put hypotheses out there and make lots of little tweaks. Sometimes it takes as little as 3 to 4 hours, not years, days, weeks, but just hours for them to get enough data to be able to get a statistically significant result. For instance, the shopping cart that I mentioned, when they moved it to the right versus the left, it led to a few tenths of a % higher conversion rate. Now, that may not sound like a lot, but when you think about it, 0.2 of a % across hundreds of millions of consumers, and what does it cost to have the pixels on this side versus the pixels on that side? Well, nothing. So that's a pretty good return on your investment. And so they're constantly making these types of tests to see whether or not they can get little improvements in their performance. It's not just web companies, it's also offline companies. One of my favorite examples is my friend Gary Loveman. He was a graduate student in the PhD program with me at MIT. He went off to become a professor at Harvard, and a few years later, he ended up as the CEO of Harrah's, the casino gaming company. Now, they didn't hire him because he had lots of executive experience. Actually, as far as I know, the only executive experience he had was managing one secretary, or one half of a secretary. He had no background in casinos. Actually, to this day, he does not even live in Las Vegas. He lives in Wellesley, Massachusetts, and flies out there. So what did he have? Well, he had an ability to crunch numbers and set up controlled business experiments. At Harrah's, he took this attitude of crunching the numbers and took them from sort of a second or third tier casino to the biggest gaming company in the world. And as he tells it, he came and spoke to my class a little while ago, he says that the real key is transforming the culture to one that's focused on not just, finding bigger fountains and prettier showgirls, but really running through the numbers to see what actually drives customer behavior. In fact, he says that there's just 2 ways that they can guarantee you to get fired from Harrah's. One of them is if they catch you stealing from the company. Now, that's a principle that's been around probably for centuries. The second one is if they catch you running an experiment without a proper control group. Now, that's something that you probably didn't have in a lot of companies a few years ago. But today, they are very careful about their experimental methodology, testing certain decisions, and having control groups. There are many other examples. I'm not going to go through all of these. You can read about some of them on my webpage of companies doing experiments. But this is sort of the new way of doing R&D, is to, instead of spending a lot of time with guys in white coats, doing R&D, you go out and test things in the field very quickly. The third thing is sharing. The internet is making it much easier to share information. I talked about some big innovations, but I want to also emphasize that very small innovations can be shared more rapidly and disseminated. At Cisco, I was recently visiting, and they were telling me about their Macintosh support. Well, it turns out that although there are about 10,000 people who use Macintoshes at Cisco, they don't support them centrally at their central IS group. So how do people learn about it? Well, Cisco has a bunch of these wikis that people can just enter information. It's like Wikipedia, but it's internal to their company. And when people started using Macs, they created a little Mac wiki that had tips and tricks. For instance, one of them was that if you want to use the printers that are set up for Linux, you make a small set of changes, a little patch, and now you can use your Macintosh printers throughout the organization. This is one very small innovation. It's not terribly valuable by itself, but you multiply that by dozens, hundreds, thousands of other small innovations, and you have a measurable improvement in performance at Cisco. They just put the innovation in place, the infrastructure in place, and then the innovations were shared more easily. I'm going to skip ahead about some of this information. And the third thing is the ability to replicate innovations and processes more easily. Again, information technology can easily replicate bits, and you see, to pick a random book here, you see that when Amazon comes up with the shopping cart improvement that works on the book about Darwin, it can also work for all their other books and with all the hundreds of millions of other customers that come to them. So each innovation gets multiplied digitally. So that's true for software and internet companies. But again, it's also true for traditional companies. And the way that it becomes true is when those companies take their processes and embed them in a digital infrastructure. They digitize them in some way. So an example of that is CVS, the drugstore, the pharmacy. A few years ago, their stock price was really struggling. They weren't doing too well, and they traced big part of the problem was that the prescription drug ordering process was very dysfunctional. And that's actually a main driver of business in a pharmacy, is people come in for the prescription drugs, then they buy other things, so it's very important to their profitability. It turned out that fully 27% of their prescription orders had some kind of a problem. And customers were quite disappointed. Typically, the problem was actually fairly simple. People would come in, they would drop off their prescription, and then when they came back to pick it up, it turned out that they couldn't find the name in the computer. Maybe their middle initial was wrong, or their social security number was inverted, or the insurance wasn't correct. And so they would have to correct that on their second visit, and when it was corrected, they have to come back a third time to pick up the drugs after it was produced. They changed that process around a little bit so that when people dropped off the prescriptions, they would not let them leave until they entered the information into the computer, and they could instantly check through their infrastructure whether or not they were in the database. And if they weren't, they would fix it on the spot. And again, most of the time it's a very simple thing, a misspelling of the name or something. And that way, they could be sure that when the customer came back, they'd be able to deliver the prescription. This led to a huge improvement in satisfaction. And of course, they were able to, by having it in the technology, they were able to make sure that 100% of the time, all future customers got the same level of treatment. But the most important thing is that once they had embedded it in the technology, they were also able to replicate it to over 4,000 other locations. So they took that innovation that improved performance at one drugstore, one pharmacy, and they made it 4,000 times more valuable. And what leading companies are now doing is they're innovating their processes at one location and finding a way to replicate that. New recipes, new techniques, new processes. And this gives them a big competitive advantage. So what's the role of information technology? Well, IT is really behind all four of these revolutions. It's lowering the cost of processing and storage, and thereby lowering the cost and making possible the kinds of detailed measurement, experimentation, sharing, and replication that I just talked about. Furthermore, these practices reinforce each other. Each of them is very valuable individually. Just one of them, measurement or experimentation, is a revolution by itself. But what makes it even more powerful is that they're synergistic with one another. If you can do an experiment and then measure the results in much more detail, that's far more valuable. If you can then share that with other people and replicate it, it further multiplies the power. So that's one of the reasons why we're seeing those leading firms pulling away from the laggards in so many different industries, is that they have adopted these practices, and that's turbocharging their innovation and therefore their productivity growth. So before I turn to questions, I just want to leave you with a couple of general lessons or principles. One is that these steps can be combined in a sequence, usually starting with experimentation, then measurement, sharing, and then replication. And this is accelerating the pace of discovery and, again, separating the winners from the laggards. And there are three main implications for management. The first is that in this new world, this digital world, innovation is far more valuable than it used to be. And you need to recognize the heightened value of innovation by having different kinds of people that you hire, different incentive systems once they've been hired, changing the overall culture like Gary Loveman did at Harrah's to embrace experimentation and replications. And remember that this isn't just grand innovations that change your whole company or industry. Even little innovations like how you do printing at your printers can be subject to these kinds of principles. The second thing is that you want to invest in technologies that make it easier to collect and measure this information, to codify it, to share it, and ultimately to replicate it throughout the organization. And there are a whole set of technologies that do each of these things that have just become available in the past 5 or 10 years that you can tap into to make this easier. And finally, bear in mind this four-step process of experiment, measure, share, and replicate. You don't have to do all four right away, but be thinking about each of them. They reinforce each other, and they're more valuable. They're complementary when used together rather than when used separately. So let me stop there and give you a chance to ask questions and have some interactions. But thanks very much for giving me a chance to share this information. So, Chris?
10 minutes for questions.
Okay, great. So 10 minutes for questions. Who'd like to go first? Over here.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could say a few more words about...
I think they want you to use the mic here.
You say a few more words about, excuse me, about the incentive structures in organizations and how they could be an impediment to sharing, and especially in a competitive environment.
Yeah.
How do you do that?
Yeah. No, that is a great point because what many of the companies are doing is they're putting in more pay for performance and trying to reward results, which is, I think, part of the approach. The danger is that if you make things too competitive, if you sort of rank people one against the other, then it creates a disincentive to share the information. So there are a number of examples. One of my colleagues, Wanda Orlewkowski, looked at a company that implemented a new technology for sharing information. And they actually found that it wasn't used at all. People were not sharing the information because of the problem with the incentives. I can go into a little more detail. This was a consulting company where people were rewarded basically for billable hours and for solving problems, and in particular for having knowledge that no one else in the company had. I mean, implicitly, that was how you got to be a big shot, was being the expert on something. So the last thing these people wanted to do was take time away from their billable hours to put their expertise up on some kind of a wiki and then let everybody else be just as knowledgeable as they are. So this technology, which they spent millions of dollars on, basically lay unused. They used it a little bit for basically as a substitute for email, but that wasn't what the intention was. So what did they do? So they went in and they changed the review process in such a way that they would keep track not just of your billable hours, but also how much information you contributed and how much benefit other people got from that information. They explicitly made it part of the review process. Now, they weren't able to be quite as objective on some of these sharing metrics, so they weren't able to put it down to like a specific dollars of revenue. So it was part of a subjective review that your bonus was based on, in part, based on what your colleagues would say. Now, there are people who are trying to make it more objective. For instance, another colleague of mine, Marshall Van Alstyne, is doing some work at the Center for Digital Business, creating internal knowledge markets, where basically it's like an internal, I guess you call it like a Wikipedia, and every time somebody contributes information, it's tagged with who the contributor was, and every time somebody reads the information or uses it, it's tagged with that information as well. And if you contribute articles that many other people are using or reading, basically your points go up. And then they can keep track in a sort of more quantitative way of who's adding to the knowledge base of the organization and who isn't. So there are some ways people are doing that, but you're exactly right. This is A, very important, and B, I don't think it's entirely been figured out yet, but that's part of why some company, actually what I tell my students is that if this was all reduced to a cookbook, then everybody would be doing it and no one would have competitive advantage. So in a way it's good that there's still a little uncertainty about the optimal way to do this, but we see some companies that seem to be succeeding. Yeah.
Hey, my name is Martin. Thanks for sharing all of these ideas. I want to go back to the beginning where you linked the digital innovation to the recession. And since you have been doing research on ICT and productivity for so many years,
this one or a little later?
Yeah, just to close this argument of the recession. So since you've been doing research on ICT and productivity so many years, what's the sense you're making of this entire story? That okay, linking to Schumpeterian business cycles, actually now we should be doing good and the productivity should be doing great, but there's a recession. There are the people who say, well, we just messed up financially. The real economy is doing better than ever. What is the sense you're making out of these sometimes confusing, contradictory empirical findings?
In 30 seconds or less. So there are a lot of components going on to the problem. The financial crisis, and I'm not going to get into all of that, and some policy mistakes. But let me talk specifically about productivity and unemployment. Let me see if I can go back here. And what's going on there. It turns out that productivity is actually doing quite well, where productivity is going up quite a bit recently, even though unemployment is down. And actually, the GDP is going up. As you may have heard some time ago, the recession officially ended because GDP is growing now at a not a bad pace. And the same thing actually happened in the previous recession. The other really bad one that you see here stretching out was the last recession. In fact, H1 seems to be taking longer than the one before. So there's something that's changed in the economy which is leading to the output increasing without employment increasing. In these earlier recessions, when the economy went down, so did productivity, so did output. And so they kind of went together. Employment went down and so did productivity. This time around, employment is going down, but productivity and output is going up. Now the gap between those represents the ability of firms to produce more output with fewer people. At some level, that's a good thing because it means that we're all creating that much more wealth per person. The problem is we don't have enough aggregate demand right now. There's two ways to have your output to input ratio go up. One is by having output stay the same or grow slowly and have input go down. A better way is to have input stay the same or actually even go up and output grow faster. Unfortunately, we've mostly been doing things the first way rather than the second way. I think information technology is part of the change in productivity. I don't think it has as much to do with the overall amount of output in the economy. So the ratio, I give credit to digitization, the improved productivity. The lack of demand I blame that on the macroeconomists and the people who are managing the economy on the other side. So that would be my answer. Do we have time for another question? Yes?
One quick sort of researchy type question, Eric. I know in your past work, you've gone inside firms and organizations to look at the way that they use these new technologies. How do you actually do that in the conduct of your research? Do you have people who go in and interview managers? Do you look at changing organizational structures?
Yeah.
And are those mostly folks at the business school, or do you also bring in sociologists and people who work on organizational issues?
Well, in brief, all of the above. One of the delightful things about being in a business school is, opposed to, say, an economics department, is that I spend as much time interacting with managers as I do looking at the economic statistics. And I feel like this is really key to getting insight to what's actually happening in the company. Sometimes I almost feel like I'm cheating when I'm in a meeting with people at the National Bureau of Economic Research. They've all been looking at the economic numbers, and I've actually talked to each of those little dots. I've talked to the people. And this is the big advantage that we have over, say, physicists. You know, physicists can only look at the data and they don't know what they're thinking, what the electrons or stars are thinking. But we have an opportunity to talk to them. So I spend a lot of time visiting companies. I just came back from Australia, where I visited a bunch of different companies. I'm on the board of directors of one company and visited a number of others. We do case studies. Much of this work started with a case study at Cisco, where they describe some of their ways that they're driving innovation. And then once I get those sort of hypotheses from the case studies, what I try to do is form a testable hypothesis that could be quantified and say, okay, what are the implications for the rest of the economy? If, so the CVS example, that was actually my colleague, Andrew McAfee, wrote a case study of that. And I said, that's really cool. I wonder if that's just at one company or if that's happening more broadly. And so we went ahead and said, well, if it's happening more broadly, then competition should become more Schumpeterian. Then people should the winners should replicate their processes and dominate more quickly than they did before. So we went and got the data that I showed you in the first 3 or 4 slides, where we saw that growing turbulence from a broader economic statistical point of view. But I think this combination of field work, sometimes with sociologists. I visited one company with Melissa Mazaman. Is she Melissa here? I think she's at USC now. We visited a company and looked at the data gathering they had there. She's more of a sociologist. And those field work typically lead to some kind of a more data-driven testable hypothesis, and that's where I can add a little more value to the projects.
We have time for one more question, if anyone has one.
Right here in the front, yeah. Actually, why don't we let the mic come on up? Come on up.
Great talk today, by the way. Thank
Thanks.
you. The one thing I had a hard time understanding was if the gap between the leaders and the laggers is increasing,
yes,
and the concentration is also increasing,
yes,
why has the turbulence also increased? It seems like that should also be flattening out and actually decreasing.
Well, that's first what I thought. I figured that if the leaders are pulling away, then they've kind of got a more dominant position. It's harder for other people to catch up. But if you think about it, that doesn't have to be the case. It's not contradictory for the winners to be winning bigger, but they're more precarious. So the way to think about it is that a company, well, okay, here, I'll give you a very concrete example. 8 years ago, I had an internet entrepreneur come to my MBA class, and he was talking about industries. At the end, people said, my students were, what should I go into to make a lot of money? And he was describing, that's what MBA students focus on. So he was describing different industries you go into. He said, well, one that you shouldn't even bother going into is search. I mean, Yahoo has that locked up. They totally dominate the industry. They're making all the profits. No one else is going to be able to come in search. Of course, while he was speaking, Sergey Brin and Larry Page were getting funding for Google and were launching it, and we all know how that turned out. So that's a sharp example of how a company can be completely dominating, making lots and lots of profits, but it's still very precarious. You get more turbulence compared to previous times. Now, that's the internet industry, but what our data show is that the same dynamic is happening, albeit to a mitigated extent, in all industries throughout the U.S. economy. And that's the essence of Schumpeterian competition. You win big, but if you don't keep up, somebody else is going to out-innovate you and come on top of you. So with that key point, let me just wrap up and say it's been a real pleasure to have a chance to interact with all of you. Please do visit my website. All the papers that describe this information in more detail are available there, and they're all free, so feel free to read them and send me your questions or comments if you have any. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot. That was great.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So you're